Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The phone woke me at 4 in the morning. My wife slept through it. She shifted once beside me, turned her face deeper into the pillow, and left me alone with the ringing in the dark. Downstairs, the kitchen calendar still showed February, though it was May. A blue dish towel hung from the oven handle where she always left it after drying her hands. Tipton was on the other end, using the same flat delivery he had used 6 times before. The 7th pilot was back, cognitive status unknown, medical staging in the East Wing. My presence was requested in the containment block. I drove 12 minutes across the desert floor to the east gate of the ARD complex, the Astronautical Research Directorate's classified test facility, 40 miles from the nearest town in southern New Mexico. 2 years of this drive in one variation or another. 2 years since Project Kingfisher put its first test pilot through the experimental hyperdrive and assigned me to evaluate what transit did to a mind. My title was Senior Flight Psychologist. My function was simpler. I decided whether a pilot was psychologically fit to engage the drive before his jump, and I classified what remained of him after he came back. 7 men had engaged the drive over 26 months. All 7 returned to their target coordinates, alive, ships undamaged. All 7 stepped out of the recovery capsule unable to state their own names. The memory loss was total and specific. Every returned pilot kept motor function, language comprehension, spatial reasoning, and the ability to follow basic commands. The transit stripped everything else: name, rank, service history, family, childhood, the face of a mother, the address of a home. The agency's clinical designation was navigational trauma, a phrase I had typed into 6 intake reports without believing it described what was happening. I badged through the east checkpoint, past the double security door into the containment wing, and found Tipton waiting in the corridor outside processing. Gary Tipton was a man who had worked containment for 11 months and treated every new return with the same professional calm he would bring to a shipment of laboratory equipment. He walked me to intake while briefing me on recovery status. The 7th pilot, Lieutenant Mike Dawson, had been extracted from his capsule 90 minutes ago, responsive to verbal prompts, ambulatory with assistance, visibly uninjured. Standard presentation. Dawson was sitting upright on the intake gurney when I came in. I'd known him during pre-flight, a steady, precise man, 31 years old, competitive handball player, engaged to a woman named Laura, who sent care packages to the facility every 2 weeks. He had scored clean on every psychological metric I administered. I had signed his flight certification 11 days ago. The man on the gurney had Dawson's face and nothing behind it. He tracked my penlight when I moved it. He repeated words I said to him. He squeezed my fingers when I asked him to demonstrate grip strength. When I asked his name, he watched my mouth as if the question belonged to a language he was still learning. When I asked if he knew where he was, he looked at the ceiling tiles and said nothing. I ran the standard cognitive battery. Language processing intact. Short-term recall functional. He could repeat a 5-word sequence after a 30-second delay. Long-term memory was a clean absence. I showed him a photograph of Laura from his personnel file. He studied it the way a man studies a painting in a gallery. Mild, detached interest in a face that carried no weight. I noted everything. Signed the intake form. Recommended placement in modified containment. Padded walls, restraint gloves, continuous monitoring. These precautions had been added to protocol after the 4th return, when we learned what the pilots did with their hands if you gave them a hard surface. Tipton walked Dawson to his assigned cell. I watched through the observation window as the orderlies fitted the reinforced mitts, heavy, triple-layered gloves designed to prevent a man from gripping, scratching, or gouging anything. Dawson let them dress his hands without resistance. He sat on the padded bench and stared at the far wall. I was about to leave when Tipton caught my arm in the corridor. He had something else to show me. Captain Alan Falk, Pilot 6, had returned 3 weeks prior. His containment cell was 4 doors down from Dawson's. During a power fluctuation the previous night, the monitoring cameras on Falk's cell had gone dark for roughly 40 minutes. When the feed restored, the cell had changed. Tipton keyed the door. I stepped inside and stopped moving. Every wall, every floor tile, every ceiling panel. The soft covering had been torn away, and the surfaces underneath had been carved into a continuous star map. The cuts were so deep the structural material showed through in places. Pale concrete exposed in gouged channels, wiring conduits visible where the carving went deepest. The room looked hollowed out from inside, as if something with extraordinary accuracy had eaten through every reachable surface and left behind a diagram. The carvings covered roughly 80 square feet of wall, floor, and ceiling in an unbroken field of curves, coordinates, cluster markers, and orbital pathways. They were beautiful in a way that made my chest hurt. They were the work of a man whose fingers had split open to the second knuckle, dried blood filling the carved grooves like ink in an engraving plate. Falk sat in the center of the floor, hands in his lap, palms up, the ruined fingers curled inward, calm, breathing slow and even. His gaze passed through me, past the carvings, fixed on something beyond the walls of this room, past anything I had clearance to reach. I had seen carvings before, every returned pilot given time and access to a surface harder than skin, eventually carved. The early ones, pilots 1 and 2, had managed shallow scratches in paint, simple marks. Shapes the debriefing team initially attributed to agitation, repetitive motor discharge, psychogenic compulsion. By Pilot 4, the marks had become recognizable as coordinate notations. By Pilot 5, the cartography team admitted they were looking at stellar maps. Falk's cell was a different order of magnitude. 3 weeks of scattered carvings had been replaced overnight by a single, unified, impossibly detailed navigational chart produced in 40 minutes by a man using his bare hands. I ordered a full medical workup for Falk and told Tipton to double the observation cycle on Dawson. Then I pulled out my phone and called Dennis Rowan, the program's chief cartographer, who kept an office in the analysis wing and slept on a cot beside his equipment. I told him to get to containment. Something had changed, and I needed someone who could interpret what I was seeing. Rowan arrived within the hour, carrying a portable scanner and a tablet loaded with the composite database he'd been building for 18 months. Dennis Rowan was a quiet, careful man with a background in deep-field stellar cartography. Kingfisher had pulled him in to answer a question the agency found embarrassing. Were the pilots' carvings real? Were they mapping anything, or producing elaborate garbage, pattern-rich noise from damaged brains? Rowan's answer, delivered to program leadership 3 months ago and received with profound bureaucratic silence, was that the carvings were real. Every pilot's marks, when digitized and translated into standard stellar notation, described positions within the same spatial region. The mechanics were internally consistent: gravitational relationships, orbital periods, luminosity gradients. The region simply did not exist in any survey of the observable universe. Rowan had checked it against every catalogue available to a man with his clearance. The pilots were mapping a place absent from the sky. He spent 2 hours scanning Falk's cell, working methodically from the north wall in a grid pattern and logging each carved symbol against his composite database. I sat in the corridor and watched through the observation window. Falk never moved. When Rowan finished, he brought his tablet to me and opened the overlay. 6 pilots' worth of carvings, accumulated over 26 months, rendered as a single navigational chart. Each pilot had produced a different section within the same larger structure. The early contributions were rough, fragmentary. Each successive return had added finer detail, wider coverage, deeper specificity. Falk's overnight output filled an enormous connective section, linking most of the existing fragments into a continuous map. One sector remained unfinished, a gap in the upper right quadrant where the coordinates stopped. "Every one of them is drawing the same place," Rowan said. He kept his voice low, professional, but his finger trembled slightly against the tablet screen. "And they're getting closer to finishing." I asked the question I did not want answered. Closer to finishing what? Rowan held my gaze for a beat, then shook his head. He did not know, but the rate of completion was accelerating. What had taken pilots 1 through 5 over a year of slow carving? Falk had advanced by a third in a single night. I did not get time to sit with the implications. Colonel Ray Jessup called me to his office in the command wing within the hour. Jessup ran Kingfisher the way he had run 2 prior classified flight programs, with clean budgets, filed reports, and an unsentimental respect for acceptable loss. A program director who understood that experimental aviation killed people, and who believed the hyperdrive's transit success justified the cost. 7 pilots had engaged the drive. 7 had reached their target coordinates in transit times that made conventional propulsion look ancestral. The Department of Defense wanted a manned deep-range test within 6 months. Pilot 8 was already in pre-flight training. Jessup needed 2 things from me: a completed psychological evaluation of Dawson, filed within the week, and my certification that Pilot 8 was fit to fly. He said this across his desk. I told him the carvings were escalating. Every pilot's maps described the same impossible region. Falk had produced in 40 minutes what should have taken weeks. A pattern was emerging, and we had no explanation for what it pointed to. Jessup folded his hands on the desk. "Doctor," he said, "Kingfisher has produced 7 successful transits. 7 destroyed identities. 7 living pilots. 7 intact vehicles. 7 target coordinate returns." He spoke gently, as if correcting a junior officer's arithmetic. "The drive works. The cost is not stable. The cost is being studied. By you." He let that settle. Then he reminded me that my evaluations for pilots 1 through 7 were on file, each one certifying acceptable risk. 7 times I had reviewed the data, assessed the pilots, weighed the known costs, and signed my name. Changing my assessment now meant admitting I had been wrong 7 times. It also meant the program's psychological evaluator had knowingly certified men for a procedure that destroyed their identities. My professional standing, my clearance, and potentially my freedom depended on those 7 signatures remaining valid. Jessup delivered this in the same measured tone he used for budget reviews. He did not threaten me. He did something worse. He drew the shape of the cage I had built for myself, held it up in the light between us, and waited for me to look at it. I left his office without signing the certification for Pilot 8. I told myself I was buying time. What I was actually doing was something I did not have a clinical term for: the slow, queasy recognition that the ground I'd been standing on was not ground at all, and that I had helped lay every inch of it. In the late afternoon, I went to see Eddie Lott. Staff Sergeant Eddie Lott was Pilot 3, the 3rd man to engage the drive 14 months ago. He had been in long-term care at the facility since his return. His early carvings had been crude, shallow scratches in wall paint, rough shapes the debriefing team initially dismissed as compulsive motor behavior. 14 months later, Lott's cell walls displayed markings made with whatever he could find, meal utensils filed against the floor until they held a point, threads pulled from his clothing and used to score guidelines, and, in a few places where Tipton's inspections had removed every tool, his own teeth pressed to the surface in short, precise arcs. Lott had changed in other ways. The fresh returns were blank, cooperative, passive, empty of personal identity. After 14 months, Lott had assembled a limited functional self from the raw material of his daily existence. He could hold a conversation about immediate things. He had preferences. He liked his meals warm, disliked the overhead lights at full brightness, and had developed a habit of tapping his knee in patterns Rowan identified as coordinate sequences. I sat across from him on a low stool and ran through a conversational assessment. His speech was calm, unhurried. He answered questions about his cell, his meals, his sleep cycle. I asked him about the carvings. His gaze shifted to the wall behind me, where a dense section of coordinate markings covered the space between the ventilation duct and the observation window. "I don't know why I do it," he said. "I don't decide to start. My hands move and I follow them." He paused, studying his own fingers. They were scarred and calloused at the tips from 14 months of involuntary labor. "But when I stop, I can feel the room move." I asked what he meant. "Drift," he said. "Everything drifts when I stop carving. The walls, the floor, the whole room slides sideways through something I can't see. Carving keeps it still." He looked at me with an expression I had seen on men reporting experiences they knew sounded delusional, an apology for the truth. "I know how that sounds, Dr. Bridger, but I can feel it. When the walls are marked, they stay where they are." I wrote it down. At the door of his cell, I stopped and looked back at the carved wall behind his bench, a dense, precise section of the composite map refined over 14 months of compulsive work. Then I walked 4 doors down the corridor to the observation window of Falk's cell. Falk had not moved since morning. His destroyed hands rested in his lap. Behind him, the hollowed walls displayed their vast carved chart. I looked at Lot's window, then at Falk's. The carved sections visible through each window sat at nearly identical height on their respective walls. I stepped back until I could see both windows at once, the corridor stretching between them. The left edge of Falk's map continued into the right edge of Lot's. The coordinate sequences matched. The orbital curves aligned. 2 men who had never spoken, carving in separate locked rooms, had produced adjacent sections of the same navigational chart. The only gap was the concrete wall between them, a wall that, for the first time since I had walked this corridor, felt like an interruption in something that wanted to be continuous. I was in my office the following morning reviewing Dawson's intake scans on the lightbox when Tipton's voice came over the intercom. Clipped, professional, carrying an edge I had never heard from him before. Something was wrong in Dawson's cell. I needed to come now. 2 corridors, 1 security door, badge scan. The containment hallway stretched ahead of me under its bright overhead panels. Tipton stood outside Dawson's cell with 2 orderlies and a medical kit. He held the door for me without speaking. The padded cell had been destroyed from the inside. Dawson's restraint gloves, triple-layered, reinforced at the seams, rated for patients in acute psychotic episodes, were shredded on the floor. He had chewed through them. The outer shell hung in long strips, saturated with saliva and blood, where his teeth had split the stitching and cracked against the internal reinforcement. Fragments of gum tissue clung to the material. 2 teeth, a canine and a premolar, sat on the padding like dropped coins. With his hands free, Dawson had attacked the padded wall directly in front of his bench. The soft covering was ripped away in sheets. The plaster behind it was broken through. In the exposed concrete underneath, carved nearly half an inch deep across a section roughly 2 feet wide, was a star map. The map was precise. Clean curves, sharp coordinate markings, cluster notations placed with the accuracy Rowan's team had come to expect from the returned pilots. The tool marks in the concrete were narrow, regular and deep. Too narrow for fingernails, too regular for broken plaster or improvised instruments. I looked at Dawson. He sat against the far wall. Calm. Hands resting on his thighs, palms down. His eyes tracked me when I moved, the way they had during the intake assessment, mild awareness untouched by urgency or distress. I knelt in front of him and lifted his right hand. 3 fingers, index, middle and ring, were destroyed past the second knuckle. The skin was gone. The flesh underneath was gone. What remained was exposed bone, scraped clean of tissue, the distal phalanges worn to smooth, tapered points like tools shaped for a single purpose. He had carved the map with his own skeleton. The bone had cut the concrete cleaner than anything in the facility's equipment locker. The other 2 fingers on his right hand were damaged but intact. His left hand was untouched. He had used exactly what he needed and stopped exactly when the carving was finished. I called the surgical team. They transferred Dawson to the medical wing within 20 minutes. I watched through the observation window as the orthopedic surgeon examined the exposed bones under magnification and said something to the attending nurse that made her stop writing and look up. I went in and asked what he had found. The bone surfaces were polished, dense. The mineral structure at the carving tips showed compaction patterns the surgeon had never encountered in a living patient, as if the bone had hardened and refined itself for the task. He could offer no explanation for why the exposed phalanges showed no signs of fracture, splintering, or the normal degradation that follows dragging skeletal tissue across concrete. The fingers had adapted. Dawson's body had remodeled itself to support the work. They sedated Dawson for the surgical repair. The operating suite ran full fluorescent overheads, bright, even clinical lighting that washed every surface in hard white. I stood at the observation window taking notes on the surgical approach when I saw it. On Dawson's forearms, beginning just below the elbow and extending to the wrist, marks were surfacing. They did not rise from cuts or abrasions. They pushed upward through deep tissue, subcutaneous discolorations emerging through the skin the way a bruise forms after blunt impact, except these carried structure. They were coordinates, numerical sequences, positional symbols, cluster designations, rendered in the same notation system as the carved maps, materializing on Dawson's skin in real time under the bright surgical lights. I pressed my face to the observation glass. The marks continued forming, slow, steady, resolving from somewhere beneath the dermal layer, as though Dawson's body were developing a photograph exposed during transit. His chest carried a second cluster, partially visible where the surgical drape had been pulled aside. His neck showed the beginning of a coordinate string that curved behind his ear and disappeared into his hairline. I called Rowan. Then I called Tipton on the containment frequency and gave him an order. Check every returned pilot currently in the facility. Put them under the brightest available light source. Examine every inch of exposed skin. Photograph everything. Rowan arrived at the medical wing before Tipton called back. I showed him Dawson's arms through the observation glass. He recognized the coordinate format immediately. The same system the pilots carved into walls, printed on a human body from the inside. Tipton's report came 40 minutes later. His voice carried the same hard edge I had heard outside Dawson's cell. Lot had them. Falk had them. Pilots 1, 2, 4, and 5. Every man in the containment wing showed subcutaneous coordinate marks under full illumination. Some were old, faded to the yellow-brown of weeks-old bruising. Some were fresh, still darkening, still sharpening at the edges. The marks had been there all along, on every returned pilot, for months, or possibly since the day of each man's return. Nobody had looked under the right light. I stood in the corridor between the medical wing and containment, holding Tipton's report. The carvings were overflow. The maps were in the bodies first, printed from the inside by whatever the transit had done to these men. The compulsion to carve was the excess that could not fit under skin, forcing its way out through hands, through teeth, through exposed bone, onto any surface that would hold still long enough to receive it. Rowan was already cross-referencing the subcutaneous coordinates with his composite overlay when I reached the cartography lab. He worked without speaking, scanning the photographs Tipton had sent and mapping each body mark to its position in the larger chart. The new data filled gaps, extended sections, connected fragments that had seemed isolated. The unfinished sector in the upper right quadrant shrank to a tight, precise region. Whatever the pilots had been assembling across carved walls and their own skin and 26 months of compulsive, bone-grinding, tooth-cracking work was nearly complete. Rowan worked through the night. I stayed in the cartography lab with him, running on cold coffee from the lab's machine while the composite map grew on his screens. By early morning, the chart occupied 3 monitors, a navigational document of extraordinary depth, plotting over 900 individually mapped stellar bodies, 42 gravitational wells, and a web of orbital mechanics so internally consistent that any astrophysics graduate student could have calculated accurate predictions from it. Predictions about the movement of stars that existed nowhere in the observable universe. But the stars were only part of the structure. Scattered through the mapped region, occupying fixed positions within the navigational grid, were anomalous waypoints that carried none of the characteristics of stellar objects. Their records were blank for mass, luminosity, and spectral profile. They sat in the coordinate system like markers on a roadmap, permanent, positioned, obviously important enough to plot, but fundamentally different from the astronomical objects around them. Rowan had identified 63. I asked what they corresponded to. He pulled up the hyperdrive's transit telemetry, fragmentary sensor logs recovered from each pilot's flight recorder after the jump. Most of the data was corrupted beyond use, but in the surviving fragments, the anomalous waypoints appeared as stable returns the drive's navigation system had tried to lock onto during transit, fixed landmarks in a space that, by every other measure, registered as empty. The drive used them to steer, Rowan said. He was running his thumbnail along the edge of his desk, shaving up tiny curls of laminate. Whatever these are, the navigation system treated them as solid, permanent. It oriented itself by their positions the way a ship uses buoys in a harbour channel. If they were not stars, what were they? Rowan shook his head. The telemetry recorded their positions, their stability, their function as reference points. It carried nothing about their composition or origin. The lab door opened before I could push further. Colonel Jessup stood in the frame with a security escort. He surveyed Rowan's screens. The overlay data spread across 3 monitors. The transit telemetry files that were supposed to be restricted to the Flight Operations Division. His expression settled into the controlled displeasure. The conversation was brief. Jessup reminded me that Rowan's cartographic analysis had been authorized solely to determine whether the carvings were clinically significant, a yes or no question answered 3 months ago. Expanding the analysis into transit telemetry, stellar mapping, and cross-pilot data integration fell outside my mandate, outside Rowan's mandate, and potentially outside the legal framework of both our security clearances. He wanted the expanded analysis suspended and the telemetry files returned to flight operations. I told him the maps were real, the maps were converging, the pilots' bodies were producing coordinates from the inside, and something in the transit telemetry matched what the pilots were carving. Suspending the analysis meant choosing to stop understanding what was happening in his own facility. Jessup looked past me at the screens. Understanding is not the same thing as control, he said. Then we have neither. Your job is to evaluate psychological fitness. You have yet to file the evaluation I requested. He said the word yet with a weight that made its function clear. Then he left. The security escort remained in the corridor outside the lab, visible through the glass, a standing reminder that Jessup's patience had a limit I was approaching. I left Rowan to his work and went to see Lot. I found him on his bench, tracing one finger along a carved line on the wall beside him. A slow, absent motion, like a man running his hand along a railing while he thinks. I sat on the stool across from him and described the anomalous waypoints. Fixed positions in the map, stable enough for a navigation system to lock onto them, present in every pilot's carvings, clearly important, clearly something other than stars. Lot listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at the wall behind me, at the dense field of coordinate markings he had spent 14 months refining, and spoke. They have walls, he said. I waited. Floors, corners, furniture sometimes. He flexed his scarred hands, studying the calloused fingertips. I can feel the edges through my fingers when I'm working, like the point is passing through an actual place. I asked what kind of places. Lot's eyes moved across the carved wall. Rooms, he said. They're rooms. He said it with plain certainty, as if the word had always been obvious and only speech had made it strange. They're places where people used to be, he said. They hold still when everything else drifts. I asked whose rooms they were. I don't remember whose. I don't remember anything about them except the shape and where they sit in the grid. His finger found the wall again. But they're real. They're the most solid things in there. The hyperdrive simulator occupied a sealed chamber in the facility's west wing, a ground-based calibration system that reproduced the drive's sensor environment using recorded transit telemetry. Pilots trained in it before their flights. Navigation officers used it to verify course data. The system did not engage the actual drive. It reconstructed what the drive's instruments detected during transit and rendered it as a three-dimensional visual environment. The simulator had been powered down since Dawson's pre-flight calibration 12 days ago. Accessing it required flight operations clearance I did not possess. Rowan did. He met me at the simulator entrance at 2200 hours, after the security escort outside the cartography lab had rotated off shift. Rowan's clearance was flight-adjacent, granted so he could cross-reference his cartographic work with the drive's sensor profiles. That authorization had never been formally revoked, because Jessup had never imagined Rowan would use it for anything beyond routine verification. The oversight was a gift. The chamber was a sphere, roughly 30 feet across, walled with projection surfaces and fitted with a central observation platform. Rowan loaded the composite telemetry from all 7 flights, merged and synchronized, and fed it to the rendering system. The displays activated. The chamber walls vanished into projected space. I was standing in the transit layer. The space was vast, dark, and structured, but the structures were wrong. My training in psychology covered nothing that prepared me for the visual logic of what I was seeing. Rowan, beside me on the platform, went still. The foreground held rooms instead of stars. The stellar bodies mapped in the pilot's carvings appeared as distant, secondary formations at the extreme edges of the rendered space. What surrounded us was something else entirely. Rooms, floating in the void, arranged in a grid that matched the waypoint positions from Rowan's composite overlay. Ordinary human-scale rooms, suspended in the transit space like exhibits in a museum whose building had been removed. A child's bedroom, blue bedspread, model airplane on a shelf, reading lamp with a cracked base. A kitchen with a coffee mug sitting on the counter beside a grocery list held to the refrigerator by a horseshoe magnet. A military barracks room with an open locker, a uniform hanging from the door, the name tape on the breast pocket too distant to read. A living room with a television cycling through static and a corduroy recliner whose left armrest was worn through to the foam. Each room occupied a fixed position in the navigational grid. Each room was complete, detailed, and absolutely specific, furnished with objects that belonged to one person's memory of one particular place. I recognized some of them. The barracks room matched the housing photographs in Dawson's pre-flight personnel file. The same locker configuration, the same window placement, the same grey tile floor I had seen in the background of his intake photos. The kitchen matched details from Lot's pre-screening interview. Before his flight, during the standard psychological evaluation, Lot had described his apartment in Colorado Springs. The horseshoe magnet had been a gift from his father. He had mentioned it because I asked about family objects that held meaning for him, and he laughed and said it was stupid, but he had kept the magnet since he was 9 years old. I had written it in my notes. I had included it in the report I filed before certifying him fit to fly. That magnet was now a fixed navigational waypoint in a dimension that consumed human memory as infrastructure. Rowan moved through the simulator's controls, adjusting the render distance, rotating the perspective. The rooms extended outward in every direction, growing less recognizable at distance. Older memories, deeper structures, childhood bedrooms and half-forgotten apartments, and places with the imprecision of something remembered from decades ago. Their walls were thinner at the edges, their furniture less defined, as if the memories that built them had already been wearing down when the transit consumed them. At the far edges of the simulation's range, beyond the rooms I could connect to any Kingfisher pilot, were others. Different architectural styles, different eras of furniture and appliance, different configurations that suggested different countries, different decades. The transit space was populated by more than 7 pilots' worth of consumed identity. Other programs had sent men through. Other agencies, other nations, other decades of experimentation had contributed their own navigational fuel. Or something had been collecting rooms for much longer than any human program had existed. Rowan traced the navigational route the composite map described, a pathway threading through the rooms, curving gently inward, converging toward the unfinished sector. The route was clear, logical, built from the spatial relationships between the room waypoints the way a highway follows the towns it connects. Every pilot who engaged the drive extended the route by one more set of rooms. Every consumed identity added landmarks. The path was assembling itself from human memory, and it was aimed somewhere specific. The simulation could not render the destination. The telemetry ended where the unfinished sector began. I shut down the simulator. Rowan and I stood on the observation platform in the dark chamber while the projection surfaces cooled to grey around us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only thing I could think about was the horseshoe magnet, 9-year-old Eddie Lott's magnet, a joke from his father, a detail I had written in a report that certified a man for the procedure that turned his kitchen into a buoy in a harbour nobody could see. Rowan called me to the cartography lab at 6 the next morning. His rush to get the words out on the phone told me something had broken open. The problem was the coordinate frame. Every stellar map requires a reference point, a fixed origin from which all positions are measured. Rowan had been calibrating the composite against the Galactic Center, the standard reference for any deep space navigational chart. The calibration had never produced a clean fit. Minor discrepancies remained in every sector, small positional errors he had attributed to the unfamiliar geometry of the transit space. During the night, he had tried a different origin, a local one, a reference point calibrated to a specific geographic position on Earth. The map locked into perfect alignment. Every discrepancy vanished, every positional error resolved. The composite, 900 stellar bodies, 63 room waypoints, 42 gravitational wells, and 26 months of carved, bled, bone-ground navigational data was built around the geographic coordinates of the ARD facility, and the unfinished sector resolved into a detailed overhead plot of the facility itself. The containment wing, the cartography lab, the simulator chamber, the east checkpoint, the access corridors between them. All of it mapped in the same precise notation system as the stellar charts, positioned within the navigational grid as waypoints. Destinations. The containment wing carried a specific transit designation, a symbol Rowan had catalogued elsewhere in the map only at arrival points, terminal waypoints, places where a route ends. "The map is pointing here," Rowan said. "The route terminates in this building." He showed me the overlay. With the corrected reference frame, the trajectory was unmistakable. It curved inward from the outer edges of the mapped region, passed through the densest cluster of room waypoints, and terminated at the geographic coordinates of the containment wing. Each jump had widened a corridor. Each return had anchored it. The carvings on the walls and the marks under the pilot's skin were the mechanism by which the transit space mapped its own arrival point into physical reality. The pilots were beacons, the carvings were anchors, and the route was nearly finished. I went to the containment wing to verify what I already knew I would find. The corridor between Falk's cell and Lott's cell measured 18 feet 4 inches on the architectural plans filed with the facility's construction office. I had Tipton bring a measuring tape from the maintenance closet. We stretched it from doorframe to doorframe. 19 feet, 9 inches. I measured again, 19 feet, 11 inches. Tipton watched me take the second measurement and said something I was not prepared for. He told me he had been having trouble with his home address. He had rented the same apartment in Las Cruces for 4 years, and 6 weeks ago, the street name had started going soft in his memory, dissolving at the edges, losing the image of the actual road attached to it. He had written the address on a note card he kept in his wallet because one morning he woke for his shift and could not recall whether the street was Elm or Ash or something else entirely. The name on the card was correct, but when he read it, the word arrived in his mind as bare letters, disconnected from any image of a building or a street or the apartment he had occupied for 4 years. I pulled a penlight from my coat and asked Tipton to roll up his sleeves. Under the bright beam, on the inside of his left forearm, a faded mark sat just above the wrist. Old, brownish yellow, like a bruise almost finished healing. A coordinate fragment. A single positional value in the notation system I had spent 2 days learning to recognize. Tipton had never engaged the hyperdrive. He had never entered the simulator. He had spent 11 months working in the containment wing, walking its corridors, standing in its doorways, sitting with its occupants during meal service and cell inspections and medical transports. 11 months of daily proximity to 7 men whose bodies were transmitting navigational data from the inside. Transit consumed identity at once. Proximity worked slowly, cumulatively, strongest near the pilots, near the carved surfaces, near the places where the map had already bitten into matter and found it could hold. Time and memory worth consuming. I sent Tipton to the medical wing. Then I stood alone in the corridor, under the containment wing's bright overhead lights, and looked at my own arms. The mark was on my left wrist. Small, a subcutaneous coordinate fragment surfacing through the skin, carrying a positional value I could cross-reference against Rowan's composite if I walked to the cartography lab and held my wrist under the scanner. I did not need the scanner to know what it was. I had spent 2 years in proximity. 2 years of intake interviews, pre-flight evaluations, post-return assessments, cell visits, corridor walks, nights reviewing carving photographs in my office 4 doors from the men who produced them. I had been the program's most thorough collector of pilot memory. Their names, their families, their childhood addresses, their fears, their attachments, the objects and people and places that meant enough for them to mention during a psychological screening. I had gathered all of it, written it down, filed it, and carried it in my own memory as the professional record of the men I cleared for a procedure I chose to call acceptable. I was the richest source of navigational data in the building. Every detail I remembered about these men was a potential waypoint. Every pre-flight interview I conducted was raw material for the transit space to convert into infrastructure. Another room, another fixed point, another landmark on a road that ended here, in this corridor, under these lights, where the walls were nearly 2 feet farther apart than the blueprint specified and the distance was growing. The corridor was quiet. Every cell door was closed. Through the observation windows I could see Falk, motionless on his floor. Lot, tracing a carved line with one finger. Dawson's cell was empty. He was still in the medical wing, but the bone-carved map on his wall caught the corridor light through the glass. I lowered my arms. My left hand was already moving, a slow, absent motion, my index finger tracing a curve against my thigh, following a path I recognized from the simulator. The inward arc of the transit route, the one that threaded through the room waypoints and converged on the containment wing. My finger followed it the way Lot's finger followed his carvings. Automatic, purposeful, disconnected from any decision I had made. I pressed my hand flat against my leg and held it there. For a moment, I thought of calling my wife. The phone was in my coat pocket. I could feel its weight against my ribs. I could tell her to leave the house. I could tell her not to think of me. I could tell her nothing that would make sense, and everything that would feed the thing using me. Her number came to me in pieces, then her face, then the kitchen, the blue dish towel, the calendar still turned to February, the small crack in the tile below the sink. Each memory arrived with terrible clarity, and with it came the sickening recognition that remembering was not resistance. Remembering was transmission. The overhead lights were bright. The corridor stretched ahead of me, long, straight, and measurably longer than it had been when I entered it 5 minutes ago. Through the observation window of Falk's cell, the carved star map covered every surface in an unbroken field of precise, impossible cartography. Through Lot's window, the same map continued, separated from Falk's section only by the wall between them, a wall whose concrete had begun to show scored lines, shallow grooves forming in the surface, as if the map were writing itself into the material without waiting for human hands to carry it. I tried to stop picturing the kitchen. The effort gave it shape. The oven handle, the towel, the outdated calendar beside the phone, the place where morning light reached the floor first. I tried to picture the house number on the front door, and the image slid sideways in my mind, soft at the edges, already being catalogued and filed into a system I had helped build. My hand lifted from my thigh. My index finger found the curve again and continued tracing. Slow, steady. The arc tightening as it approached the point where the transit route terminated and the containment wing began. I could have called Jessup, Rowan, security, my wife. Instead, I stood in the corridor with my hand moving and understood, finally, the precise nature of my contribution. I had signed the certifications. I had named the loss. I had written the reports. I had preserved the details. I had kept the memories safe until something else needed them. I let it move. Somewhere in the dark, between stars that existed in no catalogue and rooms assembled from the lives of men I had sent there, a new space was taking shape. A kitchen I knew well, a blue towel on an oven handle, a calendar 3 months behind, holding its position as a fixed point in a navigational grid that no longer required my permission to use what I carried. The corridor lights burned above me. The walls continued their imperceptible expansion. And the map, carved into concrete, printed under skin, assembling itself now in the bones, the bodies, and the ordinary guilty hands of a man who had only ever pushed paper, moved closer to completion with every second I stood there remembering.